Let's look at a metaphor, the famous metaphor from philosophy, that sounds a lot like 107. And I think the fact that it sounds like a lot like 107 is not an accident. I mean, this philosopher is concerned to make somewhat similar points to the ones Wittgenstein is concerned to make here. But then let's also notice the differences, and notice the specificity of Wittgenstein's metaphor, and its aptness for a metaphor for his way of proceeding philosophy, as opposed to this other philosopher's. This other philosopher is Kant. I'm thinking of a famous metaphor from the introduction to the first critique, A5, B9. So he's, in a rather Kantian way, engaged in a rather characteristic reflection on those philosophers who want to extend our capacity for pure reason or knowledge beyond its legitimate exercise. So it lapses into, Kant himself will say, a kind of emptiness. Misled by this sort of proof of the power of reason, the demand for the extension of knowledge comes to recognize no limits. We want to be able to know everything. We want reason to be able to get a grip on any kind of object we can imagine, and imagine that we have a relation in which we can judge truly or falsely of it. And then he gives us the following metaphor. The light dove, cleaving the air in her free flight and feeling its resistance, might imagine that its flight would still be easier in empty space. So it's not the metaphor of the ice, but it has some things in common. We have a dove flying. In flying, the dove encounters the air as something that resists its wings. Gotta fight the air to fly. And so, the philosophical dove, the dogmatic philosopher, the person who wants to, as it were, do without resistance, thinks, this would be really easy. There was just no air. If there was no resistance, then I would really be able to fly. I would be able to get to my mother like my thought of my mother reaches right for my mother. Boom! So there's a metaphor here. And it's a metaphor that has some things in common with Wittgenstein's metaphor. Let's first note some of what it has in common before we note the differences. Something that's a condition of the possibility of the activity. In the one case, flying. In the other case, walking. Requires a certain kind of resistance, a friction, something that pushes back on us. The medium of resistance in our philosophizing we encounter as the sort of encumbrances of our finitude. And we think that we would really be able to do this activity well if we could overcome these conditions of our finitude. If we could just comport ourselves without the resistance that this medium yields. And then we lapse in this metaphor into a kind of emptiness, where we actually can't do the thing we want, though we think what we're doing is formulating a conception of ideal conditions in which we'd be able to do it even better. We could talk a lot more about the analogies. I think they go fairly deep. But at least there are some analogies there. It's a somewhat similar metaphor for a kind of picture of how to go wrong and a failure to acknowledge something that are essential conditions of the exercise of the capacity, and trying to come up with a picture of what it would be to really exercise that capacity in a super way, which winds up actually depriving us of the concept of the capacity we want. Flying, walking, philosophizing really well, thinking really well, exercising reason or knowledge in Kant's case, speaking and thinking in Wittgenstein's case. But now let's notice some differences. So, in Kant's analogy, we start in the position of the dove. The point of departure for the analogy is the flying dove. Things are going fine. But the dove is imagining a way things could be better. The philosophical dove thinks, if I could just get rid of all of this air, then I'd really fly. And it's also worth imagining for a moment what happens if that happens. What happens is the dove falls like a stone. In fact, Galileo teaches falls at exactly the same acceleration that a stone falls. The difference between doves and stones only being due to air friction. So it just plummets. Also, what is the analogy for Kant? Well, the air resistance here for Kant is analogized to something like our sensible nature. Our embodiedness, our having senses, our being dependent upon our sensory interaction with objects and so forth is the material upon which the possibility of cognition lives. And so the illicit imagination of a way of being able to proceed in which knowledge or reason are less encumbered is one in which we imagine these factors away. We imagine something like the capacity of reason just being able to do what it wants apart from those conditions. And so, what's the form of the moral in Kant? Well, the form of the moral one could put this much, because this metaphor fits Kant's different critiques, each in a different way. It's a very abstract metaphor for a great deal of Kantian philosophy, but putting it very abstractly, the metaphor then is that what we must do is, as it were, acknowledge our finitude, not engage in forms of philosophy involve these hyperbolic extensions of aspects of our capacity that think that depriving ourselves of internal aspects of those capacities, like our embodiedness, our sensory nature, and so forth, is going to allow us to exercise them better. All of those things I just said about Kant might seem to have some relation to Wittgenstein. It doesn't seem to me wrong to say Wittgenstein wants to acknowledge the conditions under which we think is essential to the capacity of thought, or that we need to acknowledge our finitude, and there's a kind of way in which we conceive of reason or thought as being able to be exercised apart from those conditions. But I don't think it gets at the specificity of Wittgenstein's metaphor. It's not that it's wrong. So let's notice the differences now. So the first thing to notice about Wittgenstein's metaphor is, if it was just a transform of the first feature of Kant's metaphor, we would start on rough ground. We would start with the walking person, like we start with the flying dove in Kant, and then we'd think, oh, it must be even better over there or something, where we don't have the rough ground, as it were. Right? But that's not where we start, Wittgenstein's metaphor. We're already on the ice. On the ice is where we find ourselves. That's the point of departure from which Wittgenstein's reflections then address us. It's already slippery. That's where we are. That's the first difference. The second difference is, what happens when we're on the ice? It's not that we drop like a stone, and that we have no sense of, as it were, being able to exercise our capacities for movement at all. We can move on the ice. It's just really slippery. When we move, we fall down. We're not in a situation where we think. You get at the end of certain Wittgensteinian dialectics, and we might reach this point, but this isn't our point of departure, where we think, it turns out we just don't have the capacity at all, as the dove doesn't have the capacity for flight at all, even flying poorly, without air friction. We still, see ourselves as, somehow equipped with the capacity to comport ourselves through space by moving our limbs. It just seems to be going really badly. We fall down and we can't get where we want. And we seem to also be frustrating and inhibiting our very aims in exercising that capacity and trying to exercise. So we have a sense of, as it were, frustrating, failed exercise of a capacity which we're not simply without. So further feature the difference of how the metaphor works here when the friction is ice and not air, and the activity is walking and not flying. Another difference is that the metaphor here is not for something like our mere embodied nature or our sensible relation to the world. But this is connected with various other things. Cora said, our being able to speak. So I take it, our words being able to grip the circumstances in which they're uttered, so that they determinately mean and can be understood to mean the things that they do. So here it's not our capacity for knowledge and its conditions, but it's our capacity for making sense. I mean, a way of bringing this out very sharply would be to say, even our capacity for speaking falsely, is one that's being threatened on this ice. And then, finally, what we need to do now, therefore, given all of these differences, is not to draw some moral. If you're on the ice, if you're the dove, you can draw the moral, I wouldn't be better off over there. I'm going to keep flying right here in the air. But if you're on the ice, drawing the moral, acknowledging your finitude, leaves you on the ice. You haven't gotten off of it. So the kind of moral we need, I'll anticipate some things the Course is going to say, has to address our real need, which is the fact that we are having trouble here, moving. And it also involves a great many other features of the delicacy of this metaphor that differs from Kant, which I think also have to do in the way in which it's connected to the spider's web. Maybe I'll mention one way in which it is, and one way in which it improves on the spider's net, and one way in which it's connected to it. One thing is, if your problem is just an imagined improvement of things without the air friction, well, then you don't want to go over there. But if you're on the ice and you want to get back to rough ground, the first thing you need to know is, which way do you head? Are you heading on to even slippery ice? Which way, is the shoreline of this frozen pond, we might ask. This is connected to the metaphor of the fly bottle, It doesn't help to tell the fly to head out. The problem the fly has in the fly bottle is the direction he naturally wants to move is the one that leaves him trapped. His conception of his being trapped is that the direction of motion, which leads to freedom, is the one that seems, somehow not within the space of the options that the fly in the space of movement he even considers. This is connected, I think, with the difficulty of putting the criticism in the right place. Further feature of the metaphor that you can't get out of Kant's metaphor, then, is also not only just which way do we move, but how do we move. I think Wittgenstein sees us in our panic to be on ice and slipping as inclined to want to get the hell off the ice, which leads to one slipping. And indeed, when little children get too far out on ice, and maybe they're doing something, they're coming around, and then they stand, and then they suddenly get worried. The first thing we want to say to little children is just stand there. Just be careful. Wanting to head for the shore as quickly as you can is, trying to get off the ice quickly is a great recipe for not getting off the ice. So the primary, as it were, way of making your problem worse, if this is the form of your predicament, is haste. That the form of the critique here we need is one in which, if we try to solve our problem quickly, we simply deepen the very character of the problem we're trying to fix. There's an infinite number of repetitions in Wittgenstein of things like the greeting that among the philosophers should be "Lasst dir Zeit," take your time, and so on. But I take it this is meant very seriously and connected to this, that we will have difficulty not underestimating the amount of patience. What we need to do is stand up, figure which way we need to walk, and take very careful steps that will feel very unnatural to us if we are going to keep moving, where we need to move on ice to get back to the rough ground. And here's a third feature of the analogy, which is the one that makes it most complicated, I think, which is the way in which it takes a feature of Kant's analogy but folds it into a different point. Kant's analogy about the dove that imagines it can fly. This is why Kant starts on the side of things that he does, I think. Without air, has a phantasmized conception of what flying is. He has a picture of flying without the medium that makes flight possible. So it's an imagination of a possible space in which the capacity can be exercised, which is phantasmatic. And we need to overcome the phantasma. Wittgenstein wants that feature. of the confusion, while giving it as the description of where we find ourselves, when where we are is on the slippery ice. We're not just imagining we're on slippery ice. So the very perception of ourselves as able to move without rough ground is itself part of a phantasmized conception of the medium on which we walk. So the slipperiness isn't just because we're encountering real slipperiness and we need to get off of it. The conception of ourselves as experiencing everything as slippery comes from what we were calling before the sublime conception, what speaking thought is. And our conception of what its opposite is, the rough ground, or the humble as opposed to the ideal, or the vague as opposed to the precise, is also incorporated in that phantasmized conception of our picture. So we need to overcome the conception of things that makes things appear to us slippery in order to have the right conception of what the rough ground is that we need to get back to. So the point of criticism, so as Cora was saying, it's very common to summarize this class and be the favorite thing. What Wittgenstein says is back to rough ground. But that sort of misses the way in which part of what we need to understand is what the rough ground is, and that means rethinking our starting conception of how the two terms of the opposition are related to each other, both of which are perceived through the lens of the glasses of the sublimated conception. So although there's much in common in the initial thought of Kant's metaphor and Wittgenstein's metaphor, I think Wittgenstein's metaphor has a tremendous complexity in it.